Today we're continuing a series that we've been in this summer called Summer Love. Summer Love, and it's been all about the kind of love we want to see in marriages, right? The kind of love that we all want, or maybe we want other people to have too, that kind of love that would be most satisfying for us in marriage, and also the kind of marriage that would most honor God. And this is important for all of us who are married, but it's also important for those who want to be married eventually, and it's important for those who aren't married too, because all of us, we're going to run into people, and we're going to bump shoulders with people every once in a while, people in our families, people in our friend groups, people we work with who are married and are having trouble trying to figure that out, and maybe are going to ask you a question. Maybe they're going to look to you for advice sometimes. So we want to talk about what kind of marriage is most God-honoring. What kind of marriage, what kind of love within a marriage looks most like God wants it to look, and what kind of marriage, what kind of love within that marriage is most satisfying and fulfilling for those within it, and how do we get there? And in order to do that, I think we need to define what marriage is and why it's there and why it exists and how that works out, because I don't know if you've noticed, but over the last generation or two within our society, within our culture in the West, but especially in America, our definition, our feels and our desires for marriage in general has shifted drastically. I mean, really dramatically. Right? I don't need to show you statistics about that. You can feel it, you can sense it, you've heard it, you've seen it. If you send your kids to school today, like if you have kids like I do in elementary school, I find myself thinking back on what families were like. Like, did I notice this when I was in second grade? And what was it like then? The families are a little bit different. The way they're structured sometimes, they're a little bit different nowadays. Now, we don't need to show statistics for it because you've probably felt it, you've probably experienced it yourself. But sometimes the numbers help, right? They help to paint a picture. So if we look back, for instance, at 1980, in 1980, men got married around age 25. Did you like my font right here? Yeah. But women often got married around age 22. Okay, that sounds good. Like, and when I say 1980, I noticed some of you shuddered a little bit because it's a little bit too close to your date of birth year, isn't it? You're like, wait a second, because that's about 45 years ago, 46 years ago, depending on, right? This has been a while. Well, fast forward these 46 years here to 2026, men got married at around the age of 30, actually a little more than that, and women about the age of 29. That's a big increase, isn't it? It doesn't seem super significant. It's not like 22 to 50, but it's actually a fairly significant increase. And what it tells us is a few things, I think. It tells us that people are putting off, number one, marriage a little bit longer, and there's a whole host of reasons for that. But it also tells us that the societal pressure to get married earlier on in life is not there, which should also tell us that the societal pressure to get married at all maybe isn't as strong as it was. This isn't to shame anybody, to make you feel bad about getting married later in life, or if you're not married yet and you want to be and you just haven't. It isn't to shame anybody. It's just to point out something that's happening in our culture. It's also to point out that because the societal pressure that used to be there isn't there anymore to get married, we can understand that our view of marriage has changed in our society. It's changed. That's not to say it's necessarily for the worse, but we do know that it's changed a little bit. So what I'm hearing more and more from people is, why should I get married at all, though? I get that question sometimes. Why should I get married at all? If I can just live with this person, if I can just share my life with this person, if I can love this person, then why should I get married at all? And I'm seeing more and more of that, and I'm hearing more of that. And of course, I say, well, you need to get married to honor God, and this is how we do things within the church, and we get married, and then we live together and all that. But they go, well, I want to try this out. I want to try it on, see if it fits, and if not, I want to, jettison it and get away from it. And the answer to all of these questions used to be, well, you got to get married, just in general, for the children. If you're going to have kids, you got to get married. But more and more, we're seeing that change too. For instance, let's go back to 1980. In 1980, 18% of kids were born to unmarried parents. That's just across all. But in 2026, that number has climbed to about 41%. That's a lot. That's a lot. So if children are no longer the reason to get married, if sharing a house and combining everything about your life is no longer the reason to get married, if societal pressure isn't the reason to get married, we're left asking, why should I get married? Why should I combine everything? If I can just love my person like that, if I can just live with them like that, if I can just do this and keep myself and my finances straight and everything, and why should I get married at all? Or as my friend who's a little bit rougher around the edges once asked his long-term girlfriend, he said, why get the government involved, baby? I said, that was a dumb question, man. No, really what we're asking is, if I do take that plunge, how do I know it's going to last anyways? That's really what's at the heart of that question. If I do this, how do I know it's going to last? Maybe more to the point, how can two imperfect people stay committed to each other for a lifetime? How can two very imperfect people stay committed to each other for a lifetime of love? And what does that mean? How do we do that? Well, in order to answer that question, I think we got to look back at the beginning, particularly at the first couple. If you don't know the story of Adam and Eve, let me tell you a quick rehash of it real fast. So you may remember God created the heavens and the earth. He said, let there be light. All this stuff is going on. Here come the turtles. Here come the dolphins. Here come the plants and the animals. Here come the trees. Here come the volcanoes. Here comes all this stuff. Everything explodes when God says, let there be. And it happens. It comes into existence. God creates all this, and then God decides he's going to make humanity. God's going to make mankind in his own image. So God creates Adam, this man. And Adam is wandering around this garden. He is God's prized creation. And he says, I need to make a helper that's suitable for Adam. And so he starts bringing all the animals to Adam. And Adam's naming them all and talking to them all and playing with them all and doing all of that stuff. But God notices it's just not right. It's not enough. He says, I need to make a helper suitable for Adam. I need to make a helper that's suitable for this man. And so God causes Adam to go into a deep sleep. And then God takes from Adam's side some flesh and creates Eve, this woman. God wakes up Adam and presents this woman to her. And Adam, of course, is like, wow. Wow. And these are the words he says. The man said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman. Remember, he was naming everything. For she was taken out of man. It sounds better in Hebrew, trust me. This is now bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. Literally, this is part of me. That's how close this relationship is. I mean, imagine the relationship you have. If you have kids, imagine that relationship. They are bone of your bones, flesh of your flesh. That closeness there. Not in the same way, but it's that closeness. So then the narrator kicks back in here. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Look at somebody near you and say, one flesh. Now, this phrase, it's kind of a weird one. It's kind of an awkward one. If you've ever been to a wedding that I officiated, you've heard me talk about this phrase. This is how the ancient Israelites and the first Christians thought about marriage. They said it was a one flesh union. Because for them, literally what happened when you got married was your two lives, your two persons were fused together. Not literally, like you don't literally become one person, but metaphorically, you are fused together. So much so that from that moment on, you are now bound together in a way that you're not bound with other people. That if it was literal, if it was a literal fusing together, then no matter how much we pushed and pulled and tried to tear apart or sliced and diced, we could never fully extricate one from the other, could we? That's why things like divorce are so difficult. Like if you've ever walked through that, or maybe you've walked through the loss of a spouse, they passed away, you know how traumatic this is. No matter the reason, when a spouse is separated from the other, it's ultimately a little bit traumatic because there's a little bit of them left with you no matter what happens. You were one flesh. This is the difference in how ancient Israel thought about their marital unions versus those around them. Many of those around them thought about their marriages as contracts because women were viewed as property of men. They were the property of their fathers, and if their fathers died, then they were the properties of their brother or uncle or whoever else was the head of their family. And then they were going to be shuttled off to another man who would become their husband. They would become the property of their husband. And there was money involved, usually goats and cows and stuff like that. It was all just this transfer and payment for property. Well, in a contract situation, those of you who deal with contracts a lot, you know that if you're in a contract and one party breaks the contract, then the contract is now null and void. It doesn't matter anymore. But that's not how ancient Israel saw it. They saw this not as a contract, but as a covenant. And a covenant's a little bit different. In a covenant, you're saying, I'm going to fulfill my part of this covenant no matter what you do. And they didn't get that from some mystical Middle Eastern poem that somebody wrote. They didn't get it from some wise philosophical sage out in the wilderness somewhere. They got it from God. They watched how God interacted with them. They saw how God interacted with God's people. How, much like you and me, God's people would wander away and still God was protecting them, God was loving them and trying to draw them back consistently and constantly. God was always doing God's part. That's a covenant. That's the difference. Now, that was out of place and weird and different from everybody else around them for a long time. But after a few hundred years, there's this other philosopher you may have heard of that showed up. Actually, it's about 300 years before Jesus at this point. A guy named Aristotle shows up. And Aristotle starts talking about marriage. Now remember, most of the people around Aristotle believed that marriage was primarily for raising up children. It was the bedrock of society. This is where we brought up legitimate children. You passed off your property to the next generation. Things went on like that forever. But Aristotle looked and he said, look, childbearing is great, but it's not the primary reason for marriage. Childbearing is great, and raising kids is awesome, and if it happens for a couple, that's great. But the primary motivation behind marriage is to give somebody a partner, a companion, and they become a community within themselves. And they walk through life together, no matter what. Through thick and thin, they are there for each other. For somebody who is around 300 years before Jesus, that's a remarkably high view of marriage, isn't it? But the first Christians, they would hear this stuff that Aristotle said, and they heard all about it. They didn't think Aristotle went far enough. Here were their instructions for marriage. They said, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That's how they started their instructions for marriage. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. We see that word submit, a lot of us, and we go, I don't like that. I don't like anybody telling me what to do. And she sure ain't gonna do it. Now remember, the first Christians were raised in a time very similar to what was going on with Aristotle. Primarily around this idea, women were viewed still as property. Women were viewed as property and they weren't cherished. It drives me nuts as a girl dad. Like I got 3 little girls. I'm like, what do you mean? They're the greatest things ever. But they weren't cherished. They weren't loved. They weren't appreciated the way they should have been. And so when the Christians come around and they're like, hey, we submit to each other. Nobody was clapping. Nobody was like, wow, that's amazing. No. To give you an idea, to illustrate for you the point, here's a quote from that time period, from Pseudo-Demosthenes. Mistresses we keep for the sake of pleasure, concubines for the daily care of our persons, but wives to bear us legitimate children and to be faithful guardians of our households. Sounds fun, ladies, right? That's how the girls were viewed. That's what they were doing. So the Christians come along and they say, no. We submit to each other. Husbands to wives and wives to husbands. Nobody thought that was great. They thought it was weird. They said, you are undermining the foundations of society. You're tearing apart the fabric of our culture. What are you doing? But to understand why the Christians would do that, you need to look at this word, reverence. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. When you do something out of reverence for someone, it's because you believe something about them. You cherish something about them. Right? You don't talk a certain way in front of your grandmother. Why? Because she will beat you within an inch of your life if you do, right? No, out of reverence for her and who she's been in your life. Same thing with Jesus. Out of reverence for Jesus and who he is and what he has done in my life, I act a certain way. And Paul, writing here in Ephesians chapter 5, is giving instructions about marriage. He's saying, submit to one another out of reverence for Jesus, out of the way you feel about Jesus, out of what you know he's done in your life. Because of those things, you should begin submitting to each other and pushing each other towards Jesus. That's how this thing should work out. Paul isn't just talking to talk here. He wants people to push each other towards Christ. So what's happening is the Christians are moving away from this one flesh idea, although that still holds true for them, towards, instead of one flesh, now it's Jesus and his church are the model and the standard for marriage. Because the thing about marriage is this: there's sinners involved. In fact, let's do this real quick. Raise your hand by show of hands. Who in here is married to a sinner? Some of y'all went too quick, right? It's all, somebody was raising two hands, right? How many say, no, I'm the sinner? Yeah, I'm definitely the sinner, right? Every single one. If you are married to a sinner. Every single marriage, you are married to a sinner. But the most godly, the most Christ-like marriages are going to be the ones where they recognize that and they decide that they're going to mirror Jesus to each other. Instead of just letting it go on and saying, well, they're always wrong and they're bad and they're the sinner, they're the bad one, it's recognizing that I am just as bad as they are. We are both sinners in need of God's grace, and we are going to mirror Jesus to each other. That's why Paul goes on and he writes this. He says, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. Right, so now look, I know this verse has been used and abused by some who would try to use some kind of patriarchal tyranny to let guys always have their way in a marriage. That's not what Paul's after at all. Remember, he just said submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So now he's specifically turning to the ladies. Wives, submit yourself to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. But submit doesn't just mean blind obedience. Submit doesn't mean they're always right, you're always wrong, the end. In fact, Paul uses this same word submit here when he's talking about Jesus' relationship with God the Father. He says Jesus submits to the Father. So very obviously, he's not meaning that somebody who's submitting is inferior to the one they're submitting to. It's functional. It's saying right now for this thing, you're going to show respect. You're going to listen. If you keep reading in Paul's letter here in Ephesians 5, you find out that's exactly what Paul is after. That it's about respecting them. It's about listening to them, being guided in those moments where that's true. Submitting. But guys, you don't get off scot-free either. In fact, the bar is raised for you, I think. Husbands, love your wives. Oh, we like that part, but here's the next part. You got to focus on this part. Just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. I don't know if you remember the story of Jesus. but he was nailed to a cross for his church. Love your wives in that way, Paul says. Love your wives in the same way Jesus loves the church, that he's willing to lay down his life for her, that he's willing to give up everything for her. So many guys want to be respected by their wives, but they're not willing to love in the way they're supposed to love. Remember, this is about mutual submission. And Paul's saying, look, this is how you can most fully submit to your wives, husbands, by loving her in the way that Jesus loves you and loves his church. We submit to each other in this way. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. He goes on, he says, in the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. Now, this is starting to sound familiar, isn't it? Well, buckle up. For this reason, he starts quoting Genesis. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Look at somebody again, say one flesh. Now, this is where Paul gets it. He says, this is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. So Paul is on purpose tying together this idea of one flesh with Jesus and his church. He's saying, as Christians, your standard, your model for marriage is Jesus and the church. The relationship of Jesus and the church. He's directly tying together this notion of one flesh to Jesus and the church. Now, Paul's not just doing this because he wants to tell people what to do. He's not just doing this so everybody knows, like, Paul's in charge and this is how we all are supposed to live. No. What Paul knows is what you know, that the heart of every person is to drift away from Jesus, not towards. What that also means is every marriage left to its own devices will drift away from Jesus because there's two sinners in there, there's two sinners involved. But we want to drift towards Jesus. Well, the only way to do that, if we're constantly drifting away, then the only way for us to stay together and have a strong marriage that lasts and stands the test of time is for us to have a common anchor point that brings us back, draws us and drags us back. We have to have a common anchor point. And for that reason, I want you to hear me say this today. Strong marriages are anchored in Jesus. Jesus becomes the anchor of your life. And not in some super weird way where, like, you feel like you always have to talk about Jesus and quote the Sermon on the Mount to each other in the morning or something. Although, if you want to do that, that's great. But what if Jesus being the anchor of your marriage meant something more akin to, I lay down my life for my spouse. I lay down my wants, my hopes, my desires for her, for him. What if mirroring Jesus to my spouse means I submit, I respect them, I show that respect? When I want to lash out, when I want to be mad about something, when I want to run them down to somebody else, and I want to triangulate, and I want to talk about how they're not doing right, and they never load the dishwasher when they're supposed to, they never do it right when they do, when I want to talk about how they're just too lazy, when I want to talk about all that stuff with somebody who's not in our marriage, I lay down my anger, I lay down my irritation, I lay down all of that because I love them. And I'm mirroring Jesus. Look, take it for what it's worth. Here's my advice to you. In everything you do with your spouse, there's two things. One thing that's definitely going to happen, and one thing you can do. One, at some point, they're going to irritate you. They're going to annoy you. They're going to make you mad. You're going to be right sometimes. They're going to be right sometimes. That's the one thing that's going to happen. But the one thing that can happen is that you can choose to mirror Jesus even in the middle of that. Look for ways to mirror Jesus. Don't look for ways to get your way. Look for ways to mirror Jesus to them. Because here's the secret sauce. At the end of the day, a godly marriage is an evangelism tool. Your marriage can reflect Jesus out into the world. Just by respecting each other and listening to each other and laying down your life for each other, that is a testimony of who Jesus is. Can't you imagine a scenario or a moment where somebody asks you, like, how do you do this? Why do you do this like this? And you go, because I know what Jesus did for me, and I try to apply the same metric to my marriage. Friends, don't try to win. Try to mirror Jesus. Strong marriages are anchored in Jesus. And maybe what that means for you is you wake up and you pray together. Maybe what that means for you also is that you pray together at dinner time. You send each other a text message during the day, hey, I'm thinking about you, want you to know, praying for you today. Maybe it means all of those things. Your brain can get there. Look for ways to mirror Jesus to them. Would you let me pray for you for a moment? God, I thank you that you have given us these suitable helpers in marriage. Lord, I pray for everyone listening to my voice now who is married or wants to be married. Lord, that you would remind us constantly of the need to mirror Jesus to each other. Lord, help us to be people who exemplify and embody your kingdom everywhere we go, in front of everyone, especially in front of our spouse, that closest relationship that we have. Lord, I pray if there's any marriage that's struggling this morning, that your Holy Spirit would begin ministering to their hearts right now. I pray that you would call them into a deeper walk with you, and that they would begin to mirror Jesus, that Jesus would become the anchor of their relationship in a way they've never known, and that because of that, their marriage would grow and would be strengthened. We'll be thankful. I'm very careful to give you all the honor and praise. Amen.